Welcome to you all. It is good to see so many of you joining this session. So many of you will already know me. I'm Sue Theodorson, Head of Local Finance, and I'm delighted to welcome David Davison, Director of Spence & Partners, who are a leading firm of actuaries and pension consultants. And David has a wealth of experience in the pensions industry, in particular the local government pension scheme, and how it has an impact on the not-for-profit sector. So we really hope this session will address all the relevant issues, remanaging liabilities, and any questions you might have. David, how it will go, David will be presenting for around 45 minutes, during which time we would ask if you could actually please switch your microphones and cameras off. Then you can ask questions as the presentation is going along, either by typing them into the chat or raising your hand. And so Caroline Torres, a colleague of David's, will log all of these questions and then facilitate the Q&A session at the end. And I should emphasise now, there's no such thing as a daft question, particularly in relation to pensions. This scheme is very complex, so I'm sure you will have lots of questions to ask, but do take the opportunity to clarify any areas that you do not understand. If you want to ask a confidential question, then perhaps you could email these to John Shannon. It's john.shannon@citizensadvice.org.uk, and these will be answered by David. I think, David, it was up to 45 minutes after the session.
I'll straight to them after the session.
That'd be great. So also on the call in then is John Shannon, who works in the local finance team, and he's our lead person on pensions matters, and he's the person that provides a lot of ongoing support and guidance to you relating to the local government pension scheme, and will do so going forward. The session's being recorded and will be available on Spence & Partners YouTube channel for a period of 3 weeks, and we will share the link with you after the event. So without further ado, I want to hand over to David now. Thank you very much, David.
Thanks, Sue. Right, good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to, hopefully, using modern technology, actually share my screen all going well. Make sure everybody is everybody viewing that okay? Can I just check? Have everybody gone on to mute immediately? So.
Yeah, David, that looks fine. I don't know if you want to go up to slideshow and put it onto slideshow. You could do that.
Will do, Caroline. I'll do that now. Thank you very much. Right. Providing everybody's seeing it. Superb. That's great.
Yep.
Thanks, everyone. So, good afternoon. I'm going to say, as Sue said, hopefully for about sort of 40-45 minutes, take you through the sort of background. So, as Sue said, I'm one of the owners of Spence. I was sort of looking back, it's sort of 15 years since I wrote my first article on the issues around multi-employer schemes and particularly LGPS schemes and how they were impacting on charities. So I've been looking at this issue and working with a lot of organisations for a very long time. I've recently, over the last few years, been involved with a working party in Scotland actually on LGPS and the regulations. And what was sort of involved feeding into the new regulation changes, which I'll cover today in England and Wales as well. And I'm a sort of an advisor to the Charity Finance Group as well, and I've worked with them sort of lobbying government for sort of change around this. So also having worked with quite a few citizens advice organisations in LGPS over the years actually as well. So hopefully I can bring some of that experience to bear in the session today. So. What I'm going to so the first section really for sort of 5 to 10 minutes, I've really liked. I'm going to turn you all into pensions actuaries. So and literally it will only take 10 minutes to do that. So I'm going to give you the funding defined benefit schemes key principles. So how the pension schemes actually work, because I think that then leads into sort of all the other issues and sort of questions. And then I'll have a look specifically at sort of the LGPS background and the sort of issues that we've everyone sort of potentially facing, which has sort of led to a bit of a sort of a Hobson's choice, sort of a conundrum I've described it here, and some of the ways potentially you could deal with that. And then the new regulations that have actually come in, and there's going to be some more work coming out of those at an individual fund level. So I'll cover what I hope that actually is likely to look like. Hopefully over the next, whenever that starts coming in over the next few months, and then next steps for organisations in terms of actually if you're looking at reviewing your position. So in terms of funding defined benefit schemes, the sort of the key principles, first of all, so within local government pension scheme, up until 2014, people had their benefits provided on a final salary basis. Now, what that meant was that you had your number of years service times in the accrual rate, which is shown here, a 60th up to that point, and you then had that times the number of years service you had, and then you multiplied that by your salary at or very close to retirement. So quite a simple calculation. If you 60 times 5 years service times a salary when you left of 23,000 or you retired, then your pension's just short of £2,000 a year. If you 10 years service, you'd have double that. If you 20 years, you'd have 4 times that, and so on. If your salary was higher, you'd have a multiple of that. So it's relatively straightforward as a calculation. The big issue and the rationale for change around that time was that people were getting close to retirement. Their salaries were going up very significantly close to retirement, which meant they weren't paying for the benefits as they went along, which meant that extra cost was being absorbed by everyone else that was actually in the scheme. So the scheme actually moved to CARE, which is called a Career Average Revalued Earnings basis, from 2014, and the accrual rate improved at that stage by about 20% to a 49th as opposed to a 60th. And what happened was, if you take your salary of say £20,000 at this stage, you take your accrual of your benefits, you buy a pension in that year of £333. Then the revalued bit kicks in. So what happens is that pension then goes up each year by inflation, so that by the time the individual gets it, it's worth the same in real terms whenever they actually retire. The following year, your salary's gone up a little bit. You now actually get a slightly higher amount based on that higher salary, which again is revalued through to retirement, and so on and so forth each year until you get to retirement. And in each of those years, you actually get you total those up to get your pension. And the benefit of that is obviously that even if salaries go up very close to retirement, say in year 4 and 5, it only affects year 4 and 5, so the funding of the scheme is actually that much more certain. So what you're doing then is you're providing benefits for your staff actually in the scheme. So those are liabilities. You've got a benefit and a cost of providing that benefit. So that's the total of the liability or the promise that's actually being made. What you're trying to do is you're then trying to build up a pot of assets within the scheme that actually covers those liabilities. So that can only be made up really of contributions and investment return. So you build that pot over time. If there's a shortfall, if there's not enough money in that assets, then you've got a deficit. Now, in essence, this is a very important point for anyone participating in one of these schemes, is that the scheme really doesn't have a deficit, because the scheme has a set of promises to staff, and it has a set of assets which are allocated to you, but it effectively has an admission agreement or a document that you've signed up to, which says that no matter how much that deficit actually rises to, you're going to fund it. So it effectively has a guarantee from the employer over whatever the liabilities actually are. So that means that no matter how those change in the future, you have to pay for them. And obviously there's a relationship between the level of that guarantee and the amount of assets that the organisation actually providing the guarantee actually has. Now, the important thing about this line in terms of sort of the past here is that any benefits that have been built up to the current date, you can't go back and change them. So you can only amend any benefits going forward for the future. And the issue obviously with this is that exactly, if you're doing the same thing, exactly the same thing happens going on in the future. You build up more liabilities and you build up more assets and so on. The issue around that obviously is that the bigger the liabilities are, the bigger the risk is. So if you've got £1 million of liabilities and those vary by 10%, you've got to find £100,000. So your guarantee effectively to cover that is £100,000. But if you've got £10 million of liabilities and they vary by 10%, you've then got to find £1 million. So almost the 90% funding level is irrelevant. It's the amount of cash that's actually needed to fund whatever the potential shortfall actually is there. So you're then providing those liabilities for the members, so the members' benefits and the expenses. And what you're trying to do is you're trying to estimate how much those benefits are actually going to cost in the future. You work out those based on the salary of the individual, what inflation is going to be, because inflation is going to be added to the benefits. And obviously then you're trying to work out how long someone's going to live for, to work out how much the cost of those benefits is actually going to be. And although you're saying this is a defined benefit, it's not actually a defined benefit in that you've got all those variables, so you're making an assumption on that. So what the really crucial bit to actually understanding in terms of funding these is the time value of money. So if I'm providing you with a pension of £100 in 12 months' time, the liability for that £100 today is really dependent upon the return I'm going to get on the benefit over the next 12 months. So if I get a 2% return on it, I need to reserve. So the liability today is effectively £98. If I get 5%, the liability today is £95. And if I get a 9% return, it's £92. So I invest the 92, get my 9%, I've got £100 to pay the benefit in 12 months' time. So the actual value of the liability today is linked to the return that you're expecting to get, or what's called the discount rate. That means that obviously the higher the return you see you get there, the lower the liability actually is, and vice versa. The other thing you can see from this is that the liability is much, much higher closer to retirement than it is further away from retirement. So what that's highlighting is that, for example, at 5%, the cost of providing £100 for someone in 12 months' time is £95, whereas 20 years away from retirement, it's £38, because you're getting the return on that money every year for the next 20 years. So your £100 in that case is made up of £38 of investment, or £38 of contribution, and £62 of investment. What you can also see with this is that the lower the return, the bigger the differential is. You know, the year away from retirement, the differential is not very much. You know, if you assumed 5% return, you invested £95 and you only got 3% or 2% return, and you were £2 or £3 short, then it's only £2 or £3 to make up. But if you assume 5% and you only got 2% over 20 years, then potentially you're 50% short. You know, you're £38 and you really need to have £67. So again, that highlights the differential between these figures when you're actually trying to fund the scheme going forward, and that will come through whenever I explain how the valuation numbers you'll see work, which is really sort of depending on the return you're assuming. You will have three important pension scheme sort of actuarial sets of numbers that are provided to you. One of them is what's called the ongoing basis, which is the basis that the fund used, assuming that you're going to stay in the scheme, to set your future contributions. The other set of numbers you'll get are your accounting numbers, which is what are actually disclosed in your statutory accounts. And then the third set of numbers will be cessation. So what would actually be the cost of exiting the scheme if we decided to actually leave? So if I start with the ongoing, I'm going to make an assumption there that the expected return, or the discount rate, is 4%. So on that basis, you've got assets invested in the scheme of £1 million, and you've got liabilities calculated on the 4% basis of £1 million. So everything looks great. You're 100% funded. The assets meet the liabilities, so that looks great. So what you're doing is you're providing future service benefits, and those future service benefits are, say, £50,000 a year. The scheme will work out what level of contribution you need plus the investment return to fund for those future service contributions. So the contribution should be at or close to that future service figure, but for a lot of organisations it won't be. But I'll explain that in a bit more detail in a second. The accounting measure uses a stronger discount rate. It's got to be based on corporate bonds. So I've assumed a rate there of 2.2%, for example, in this example. Now what that means, as I said, is because the lower the return you get means the higher the liabilities actually are. The liabilities have now moved on that basis from £1 million to £1.3 million. So now on an accounting basis, you're having to disclose £300,000 of a deficit in your accounts on that £1 million, which looked fine when you were looking at it on a funding basis. And again, because you're looking at a lower return, then the future service cost is higher. So again, your contributions are going to be further away from covering that cost year on year. The cessation rate then is, if you exit the scheme, the scheme takes the view that they don't want anyone to exit the scheme and there be any risk that they leave a liability in the scheme which other employers in the scheme have to pick up. Because this is a multi-employer scheme which everyone participates in, if there's any shortfalls, those are shared out amongst every other employer. So what they do is at the point you exit, they take what's called a nil risk view of your liabilities. So that nil risk would be what would the return be on gilts? So effectively a nil risk return investing in government gilts. If I assume that the rate on that was 0.8%, then now the liability value rises from $1 million on the ongoing basis to 1.6 million. So now you've got a £600,000 deficit on your £1 million effectively that you thought was fine previously. So hopefully highlighting this, you can see how organisations can get into issues with this. If, for example, the pension scheme is only telling them what the ongoing position actually is, then they think that's fine. And then suddenly they get to a point where they're either wanting to leave the scheme or are being forced to leave the scheme. And suddenly there's a very large deficit actually in there that the organisation actually has to try and pay for. So so those are the three key valuation bases that you need to understand really. The other thing about this is you really what tends to happen within the sort of the schemes as well is that if the costs within the local government scheme in particular start to rise, then the only thing that people can do is to try and not admit more people to the scheme. So they close the scheme to new members, not surprisingly. So that reduces the overall cost. But that has an impact actually as well, because as I said earlier on, the cost of actually buying the benefits increases as you get older. Yeah, so it might be 5% for someone at 20 and 45% for someone up close to retirement at say 65. But that's not the way the scheme works. The scheme actually averages out the contributions across the membership. So what that means is for younger people, you're actually overpaying for the benefits, while for older people, you're underpaying because there's a cross subsidy effect actually there in the scheme. Now, that all works fine on the basis that as you get to retirement, older people who are retiring or leaving are replaced by younger people, so the average age stays the same. So the average contribution then therefore will stay the same. However, if the scheme's closed, that's not what's happening because the average age of the membership is now increasing. And because the average age of the membership is increasing, that means that the point where you cut that line is actually higher. So that now means that your contribution costs are going to increase as well. And gradually, as you reduce the numbers and you get closer and closer to the point that the last member is going to exit, the contributions will increase very, very materially. And that's usually the point at which organisations then start to look at the issues around the scheme, although often the problem is that at that stage it's quite difficult to actually sort of deal with. And really sort of trying to sort of look at the funding issues much earlier actually gives you a better chance of actually being able to deal with them more cost effectively. So finally, in terms of the funding, then the other key issue is how the pension scheme, the local government scheme, actually views you as a member. There's three ways effectively that the scheme can get money in to cover the benefits that are actually being built up. One of those obviously is contributions. The other one is the investment return on those contributions and the fund you've actually built up. And then the third one is what's called the covenant, or the financial strength of the employer, where you can go back and get more money. Now, to give you an idea on the covenant, what that means is, so say for example, you've got £1 million deficit in your pension scheme, but you've got assets of £10 million, then your covenant is very strong. Therefore, you can afford to invest relatively aggressively to get a higher return, which means your contributions are lower. Yeah. However, if you've got a £10 million deficit and only £1 million of assets, then your covenant is now very weak. Therefore, you can't afford to take the investment risk because that just actually worsens the position for the fund and potentially for other employers. So the fund starts to look at you as less of a sort of a good bet longer term. So they then want to take higher levels of contributions off you. So you end up almost in a catch-22 position where the contributions are actually pushing you out, but you potentially can't actually get out of the scheme. So I'll look at that in a bit of detail in a second as well. But that's the way the fund will be looking at organisations in terms of funding this. Going back 15, 20 years, the local government scheme was a big club. Everybody effectively just stayed in there and paid the same amount of money. But gradually, as people have wanted to close and exit and their benefits have sort of changed, then everybody wants to know what their share is. So the scheme now very much looks at each employer individually, depending upon their own individual set of circumstances. Okay, so Hopefully then the next bit should be reasonably straightforward now, given that you're all pensions actuaries. So I'll then be able to go into the details and how all these aspects will impact on your position. So in terms of your membership of the scheme and the sort of governance of the scheme, that's actually controlled by a set of LGPS regulations in England and Wales, a separate set in Scotland and another set in Northern Ireland. So those will actually define the rules that the fund can actually play by. The other key documents that are relevant in terms of managing the scheme are what are called the funding strategy statement, which is where the fund actually sets out the terms it has for actually engaging with you as a participant actually in the scheme, and tries to set out sort of key principles in there. And the other one is the statement of investment principles that says how the scheme is going to invest the money to actually try and build up the benefits, and how it's going to deal with employers on things like if they're going to leave the scheme and so on. So your relationship with the scheme will also be governed by your admission agreement. So at the point you join the scheme, you will have signed up to some form of an admission agreement. Well, usually you will. Occasionally I come across employers who are participating and have never actually sort of completed an admission agreement. But in most cases, there'll be one floating about in the background that sort of sets out the terms. Historically, those documents were very short and didn't contain a lot of information, so they're quite difficult to deal with, and there's quite a lot of interpretation involved of what they actually mean. The more recent the admission agreement, the more clarity there will be around each of the sort of provisions actually within it. The last thing in terms of sort of governance that's actually really important to sort of be aware of is that the council and the fund, the pension fund, are distinct. They are two different entities, and they are supposed to operate completely independently. In my experience, that isn't necessarily always the case. In fact, indeed, it's probably rarely the case. But certainly, if you're dealing with the funds, that will be one of the first arguments. So, well, we can't speak for the council, or vice versa. The council can't speak for the fund, despite the fact that both are probably linked in terms of your ultimate admission. But that's certainly supposed to be the case from a governance perspective. So lots of third sector organisations obviously joined the scheme on the basis that they had a community interest link, so providing benefits either on behalf of the local authority or for local community benefit. It's almost impossible now for organisations like that to actually join LGPS, because they won't be admitted unless you have a guarantor, such as the council or central government, for example, and that guarantor would have to directly state that they will stand over all of your liabilities. Otherwise, the fund potentially won't allow you to join. As the expected scheme return in the market as a whole has actually reduced, the cost of benefits has actually risen. So we're not in an environment as we were 20 years ago, where we had 5% inflation and 10 or 12% returns. So going back to that discount rate position, then the return you're expecting is much lower. Therefore, the value of the liabilities is higher. Therefore, the contributions you need to pay for those benefits is higher, which you'll start to have noticed in terms of your contribution. So the increased costs as a result of that tend to drive closure to new entrants. Now that's good, because it slows the pace of the increase in liabilities, though while you've still got members in there, they're still actually growing, and you need to be aware of that relationship with the value of the organisation. But as I said, the maturing membership increases the cost over time. And the other thing is that if you're closed to new entrants, you're ultimately working towards a cessation. It's going to be inevitable at a point where you run out of members, and then the cessation debt actually triggers. So you need to have that cessation cost figure in the back of your mind in terms of how you're working towards actually dealing with that. In terms of cessation, so if you as an employer cease to have active participants in the fund while other members or other employers continue to participate, then a cessation debt's triggered. So the process is outlined in the LGPS regulation. So what happens is you leave, the scheme notices that you've no active members. They are then compelled by the regulations to refer that to the fund actuary. The fund actuary produces a calculation, which, as I say, uses this nil risk basis based on gilts, and the cessation then is calculated, and that would then be served on the employer as a debt, and that would be payable by the employer. So, and then obviously you've got to then work on whether it's actually affordable or whether you can negotiate around how it's actually going to be paid. The funds in general under the regulations have a very limited amount of flexibility in terms of actually what I would describe as compromising a debt, so offering you a reduced debt. That's not to say they haven't done it, but they tend to do it very quietly. But in most cases, in the vast majority of the cases, the fund will robustly pursue the cessation debt in full, as they view that any underpayment falls on other employers or members, effectively in terms of additional contributions. So, so in most cases, as a starting point, that would be the default position. So given that, as I said, organisations have always finished up sort of in this sort of Hobson's choice problem where they've got increasing contributions as their membership actually reduces, and they'd like to actually be in a position to exit the scheme, but they can't exit because you've got an unaffordable exit debt which you can't pay, so you end up in this trap. Adding members obviously can deal with that, so potentially that can reduce the funding rate, particularly if you're adding younger members, for example. But what it does is it increases the pace of growth of the liabilities, and therefore potentially just gives you a bigger problem further down the line. And obviously, even if you were doing that, you'd have to be allowed to do that by the fund, and most funds will prohibit you from reopening, for example, if you've been operating on a closed basis for a period of time. But certainly it's been a problem, and a well-known problem for a long time. Some other issues within the local government scheme that is important to be aware of actually as well. The first one, which is a huge bugbear of mine, I have to say, and I've continually raised it with the funds and so on as well, is something called legacy liabilities. LGPS is completely unique in how it operates, in that it doesn't segment out the liabilities based on the employer that the individual was employed by. It's effectively a pass the parcel type scenario where whoever's sort of employing the member at the point they actually retire has responsibility for all of the liabilities of that individual. So an extreme example, but an example from real life that I've experienced is I had a charity that employed an individual from the council to help with the charity operation in the last sort of 2 or 3 years before he actually retired. He worked for the council for 35 years and then worked for the charity for 3 years. So what actually happened was that because he was still retaining membership in the local government scheme, all of his 35 years liabilities transferred to the charity. Now they would transfer to the charity on an ongoing basis with that, say, 4% discount rate. But at the point the charity looked to exit, then those liabilities would be converted to the cessation basis. So therefore you finish up with a huge debt. So in that case, the liability for that individual on their own as a result of doing that was about £260,000. So and one of the issues that raises as well is, if you're recruiting people and you're running an open scheme, recruiting people who formerly were members of the fund will have a huge impact on your liabilities and your ability to actually contribute to the fund or even exit the fund. One of the other things that's unusual about LGPS as well is the issue of redundancy. If you make someone redundant who's an LGPS after age 55, then they're entitled to get their pension at that age as if they had been going to get it paid at their normal retirement age, and the employer is responsible for funding all the gap. The last one of these I was unfortunate enough to be involved with. The cost was about 120,000 for the organisation because they let a member of the finance staff, made them redundant, and they were 57, and therefore the benefits they had to be paid for an extra 8 years through until retirement. So it was a very significant additional cost. So it's just something to be aware of. Don't make anybody redundant if they're in LGPS without being aware of what the costs are. The other couple of sort of issues then I wanted to cover were around, first of all, around accounting. So obviously you disclose via the pension liabilities via FRS 102 on your accounts, unless you're considered a smaller employer and your auditor gives you an exemption. So that means that the pension position is obviously very highly visible to stakeholders now, because and it's coming directly off your balance sheet. So actually, if there are things you can do about that if you need to sort of look at that, but it's certainly something that it can cause distress to organisations when you get to the point where your pension liabilities exceed your net assets, because that starts to have issues. Obviously, that accounting basis is, as I said, stronger than the ongoing basis, and it reduces your balance sheet value. So obviously, for a lot of organisations, managing that is quite important. The other thing that I'm noticing around that at the moment is that auditors are getting a bit vexed about that at the moment, because, say for example, you've closed a new entrance and you're down to sort of say 1 or 2 members, then the auditor finds it difficult then to sign off to say that that is not going to impact on your going concern basis, because if those 2 members left, it could trigger a cessation debt of an amount that the organisation actually couldn't afford. So auditors are getting are getting more and more wary of that, and are sort of checking the sort of background and getting to a point where you have to sort of negotiate some sort of terms with the fund to make sure you remain a going concern before an event like that actually happens. But it's certainly something to keep a very close eye on. The last one of the other issues really I wanted to sort of mention is around guarantees. So obviously you could be in a position where you just join the scheme as what's called a community admission body, and you have no guarantee at all. So in that scenario, you would actually be exiting the scheme potentially just based on the cessation value. Other organisations can join as what are called transferee admission bodies, transfer admission bodies, TABs. And in that scenario, that's where you would be providing services directly on behalf of a local authority. And in those scenarios, the transfer admission agreement or the tends to give you much more protection at the end of the contract. So it would tend to allow you to exit on an ongoing basis rather than on a guilt cessation basis. So that's one of the things to identify straight away as to whether you've got that sort of preferential status or not. But as I say, you'd have to be doing some form of outsourced servicing to actually have that apply to you. In terms of guarantees, they're very much a sort of a mixture. You tend to go back, if you tend to go back 15 or 20 years around this, and the participation all tends to be done on a sort of a nod and a wink, and both organisations sort of used the same lawyer, and there wasn't any protection around that. So it would be unlikely in that case that there would be any sort of guarantee or protection actually sort of put in place. Otherwise, you could have a guarantee in place, but the guarantee is very unclear exactly what it's guaranteeing. I've seen one quite recently that was guaranteeing escalation of benefits in the scheme, but not the actual benefits. So that there are really strange wordings in some of these documents, and there's a lot of inconsistency. The other thing is that the historic guarantee would be inconsistent with the current regulations actually as well. So deciphering those can often be a bit of a problem. The most common form that I actually tend to see is what I've described there as lender of last resort. And that generally says that in the event that the organisation becomes insolvent, then the guarantor will actually step in. But that's not a great deal of use for most organisations, given that you want to try and sort this out without the organisation actually becoming insolvent. So sometimes there's a couple of organisations I'm working with at the moment where we're dealing with the local authority to actually get the guarantee revised on the basis that that wasn't the intention of the agreement at the start, and therefore the local authority has been prepared to re-look at it on the basis that if that wasn't the intention, then the wording doesn't match the intention, therefore they'll change it to something that does. The final option really around the sort of guarantees is that there's something robust in place that actually says that in the event that you exit on whatever basis that actually might be, then whoever the guarantor is will provide a guarantee over all the costs and any liabilities, including the cessation liabilities. In most cases where there's a council involved, they don't actually have to take they don't have to deal with the cessation liability, because what happens is the benefits are what are called subsumed. So they move back to the local authority, for example, and are just added to their liabilities. So they continue to be funded on an ongoing basis rather than on a cessation guilt basis. So clearly, where there is a good guarantee in place, that generally will improve the funding basis and provide the organisation with better exit terms. If you've got one, again, this is where probably sort of the collectiveness of your organisations can be helpful, because some organisations do have guarantees I'm aware of. So even being able to approach your local authority or your scheme to actually sort of confirm that that is the case and how that might impact on you could potentially be valuable. Okay, so if we then go on to sort of dealing with what I've described as dealing with a conundrum, this sort of problem with sort of exit or contributions, how can you try and resolve it? So as I said, many charities and organisations have recognised closing to accrual as a priority, because it's the only way to maintain sort of affordability. Funds have been really slow to respond to this, despite clear benefits for them. What funds seem to have missed in this sort of whole sort of issue is that they really shouldn't be allowing organisations to continue to accrue liabilities, which ultimately they'll not be able to afford, because that then falls on the other employers actually in the scheme. So there should actually be a mutuality of benefit in this, but unfortunately the funds have been quite slow to identify that. And there's been a bit of a denial about the issues and misunderstanding of the impact in many cases, the impact of future accrual and solvency, sort of people, I don't say people sort of threatening that this is going to make us insolvent and then claiming it won't. But unfortunately, I have been party to a number of organisations who haven't actually sort of made it through that process. So it is a real issue that people have to sort of try and deal with. As I said, I've been campaigning around this issue for about 15 years. And there's gradually recently become a much more increasing recognition of the issues amongst all of the stakeholders, sort of government, the local authority, and councils as well. So the first sort of organisations, or the first area to produce sort of change in regulations was in Scotland in 2018. Though the issue to date there has been that they've been really poorly implemented. The funds have effectively just ignored the changes in the regulation. However, I think that's likely to change shortly. Some more enlightened English funds and their actuaries have developed informal approaches to dealing with the issues, where they've allowed organisations to exit and pay debts over a period of time, or pay at a lower rate, or come up with some sort of guarantee. But they've come up with a basis which will actually sort of deal with this. But unfortunately, they are very much in the minority. It's like, I would say, sort of 8 to 10 organisations, or 8 to 10 local authority schemes out of maybe 90, where they actually have come up with any sort of a sort of flexible exit option. So what's happened then in terms of sort of England and Wales? So we had a new bit of regulation in 2020 that looked to actually try and deal with this. So there were regulations came about as a result of a number of consultation exercises and a lot of lobbying. The new regulations were actually laid before Parliament in August and came into effect on 23rd of September. The idea was to give organisations a lot more flexibility on exits, and also to introduce what's called a deferred debt agreement, and I'll explain how those work in a bit more detail in a second. The Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government and the Scheme Advisory Board were providing guidance for funds to actually implement these new regulations, and that guidance was actually sort of signed off last month. So funds should be in a position where they can now actually properly implement the regulations. In terms of the consultation that brought these about, the positive news was that the cessation debt repayment flexibility, which whenever you trigger a debt would actually then give you the option of spreading that debt over a period of time on a sort of an affordable basis. That received very sort of significant support, so 130 out of the 134 consultation responses. So that would allow funds to enter into agreements to repay cessation debts due over a period of time. Clearly, the advantage of that is it turns uncertain pension liabilities into a fixed stream of payments. So it's like converting your pension liabilities into a bank loan where you know exactly how much they're going to cost. Some funds have already offered sort of legal side agreements that are similar to that, but don't actually meet these new regulations. So it's unclear at the moment how those would actually be adopted as part of the new regulations, but I suspect that funds will want to do something that's more official, shall we say. Funds have the discretion how to apply the regulations, and the regulations were seeking to ensure consistency and transparency. So the way they were looking to do that was they were wanting the funds to get advice from their actuary, and then once they'd done that, they were then going to publish the basis of the repayment flexibility in their funding strategy statement so that it was open and clear. And the fund has to take into account the interests of all employers and the fund as a whole and actually sort of reaching agreements. So in terms of actually looking at those sort of repayment sort of issues, so if you have a debt, like as my former example, there's sort of £600,000, then how do you actually go about paying it? Well, the uncertainties in terms of that, in terms of agreement with the fund, which you have to negotiate, is how long will you be given to pay it? Will the payments be with or without interest? Will they actually apply some sort of deduction or some sort of basis which takes into account affordability, such as if you were likely to have access to more money later on, say with the sale of a property or something like that, how that would actually sort of play out. But effectively, it's a negotiation exercise that you actually have got to enter into with the fund to see how they'll actually sort of go about applying that. The other thing is that there's a huge timing issue around this because the exit debt calculation is based on market conditions. Now, to give you an example, as a very broad rule of thumb, around 0.5% change in gilt yields or interest rates or effectively will generally add somewhere around 7.5% to 10% on the liabilities. So if interest rates went down by about 0.5%, you can work out what 10% of your liabilities are, and that would actually add that to your deficit. But equally vice versa, if gilt yields improved, as indeed they have done recently, that could actually significantly reduce your exit debt. So the timing of when you do that calculation is actually really, really important because it could have variations in the hundreds of thousands, let alone in the millions, just in terms of the sort of the timing. Also, the thing that's about the cessation debt is it doesn't take into account member movement. So if you settle the debt and members were to die or to take benefits in a different format than the valuation had assumed, then effectively the scheme benefits from that. There's no adjustment for that in your exit calculation. So you're doing that at a fixed point in time based on the membership at that point in time. The addition of the other option was then this deferred debt agreement, and again it received very strong support, 128 out of 134 organisations in the consultation. This brings LGPS more in line with other multi-employer pension schemes and standalone schemes, where it allows you to stop accruing any more liabilities for members, but without actually triggering the cessation debt, the gilt-based cessation debt. So you're in a position where you can defer that and continue to participate in the scheme as if you're an ongoing employer. So just paying contributions to keep funding the scheme as you go along. Now that obviously ceases the future accrual, which limits your risk, which is very good. The exiting employer retains all the same obligations to the scheme. So in terms of you still have the ultimate cessation debt in the background, but you don't have to pay any primary contributions because you're not building up any more benefits for staff. Ultimately, the future payments are uncertain because they're based on the sort of funding of the scheme. So you could end up having to pay additional contributions in the future. But again, would tend to be based on an ongoing funding basis rather than a cessation funding basis, which means that even variations in that should be more affordable, and the immediate costs up front are likely to be more affordable as well. And again, similar to that, some schemes already have side agreements or workarounds with this, but again, they won't be formal in relation to the regulations. So in terms of the sort of considerations then really around this is, first of all, what are the relevant events that are going to trigger a review or a termination? So if you enter into an agreement, you need to specify what would actually change the terms of that agreement, so you don't get into it for 5 or 6 years and then something happens and triggers the debt at a future point where you can't pay it. That can be things like changing the sponsor covenant, so changing your financial strength, very significant changes in asset value, or if the fund decides to de-risk. So again, that needs to be quite clear in terms of any agreement reached. Also, what's the termination of notice for either party? So if you enter into the agreement and then market conditions actually moved in your favour where you could exit, how can you actually sort of terminate? Are there regular reviews actually sort of set in, which actually then look at the costs and how contributions might change over time? And also, which investment strategy would you participate in? So some funds run multiple risk-based investment strategies. So you need to be in a position where you're in an investment strategy that has the potential for return for this actually to work. Now, obviously, if there's a potential for return, there's the potential for risk as well, but it's the only way that sort of a process actually works. So I think all of this has to be sort of very clearly documented. The funds are expected to consider evidence and use judgment and local knowledge. They've got to monitor the arrangement. There's no need for separate investment strategies as part of the arrangement. As I said, they've got to consult the fund actuary and put the information in their funding strategy statement. And the charity needs to consider over what period it wants to target an ultimate exit. Although you potentially could be in this indefinitely, it's probably not a good position to be in. It's probably you probably want to get to a point where you can try and target a point to actually get out. And there's uncertainty around how funds will apply and assess employer covenant. If you're a weaker employer, then would they be prepared to enter into this? But my argument would be, well, it's probably better than allowing you to continue funding more liabilities potentially. So as I say, the process is the funds engaging with their actuary. They agree that local process. They document it in their funding strategy statement. It's likely to be was later 2020, early 21 before the approach was agreed. As I say, the regulation guidance just came out there at the end of January. At this stage, the approach remains unclear until we actually get the information in the funding strategy statement. But if you're looking at an exit, I think, in my view, it's worth engaging early with the funds to actually say, we know this is coming, we'd be interested in doing this, and we'd be interested in doing this on this basis potentially. So what I hope that these two examples look like are, based on my examples of the 1.1 million assets, 1.6 million ongoing liabilities, and 1.6 million cessation. On that basis, you would have your £600,000 cessation value paid over 20 years, either with or without interest. So £30,000 a year, increasing each year. Yeah, and as I say, there's some examples of a process in Scotland that's already adopted that. That ceases the future accrual and provides cost certainty. So if you don't want to be worried about this, it actually just provides complete certainty in terms of your future cash flows. And as I said, there's issues around the timing of the calculation and the impact of member movements. In terms of deferred debt, in that example, you've got £1 million of assets and liabilities and the 1.6 million in cessation. Because you're fully funded on an ongoing basis, there's no secondary contributions, and you wouldn't be having to pay further primary contributions because you're not building any more liabilities. The fund could well adapt their funding basis to strengthen this and provide a buffer. So where I was saying that was based on, for example, a discount rate of, say, 4%, it wouldn't surprise me to see funds saying, okay, well, we'll apply a discount rate of 3 or 3.2%, for example, which would mean you would have a deficit, but the deficit in that example might only be 100,000 or 150,000 as opposed to 600,000. So your contributions would be much lower as a result. So obviously, again, no further accrual. You maintain investment in the main investment strategy, which could mean you've got some volatility on the results, as I suggested, and there's fluctuations in the value of assets and liabilities. Just to give you an example of this, and the value of actually the deferred debt and being invested, if you've got the assets and the sort of flexibility of assets to participate, if you were actually paying the £1 million debt, for example, over, I'd say, a 20-year period, increasing with the contributions at 3.5%, then you'd start at about £45,000 of a contribution, and you'd pay about 1.2 million in total for your £1 million of deficit. If you remained invested in the scheme, for example, over 20 years, and you got an investment return of 2% above gilts, now given gilts at the minute are only about less than 1%, that's a total return of about 3%. Your contributions to start off with that would be about £8,000 and you'd only pay about £205,000 of your £1 million of exit debt, because the balance over the 20 years would be made up of investment return, a bit like going back to the slide that I actually presented on an individual basis earlier on. So there is a value in the deferred debt and remaining invested, providing you can manage to afford the variations actually going forward if your contributions, for example, were to increase if market conditions went against you, for example. So I think in terms of if you're reviewing this, if you actually need to sort of consider your position, I think initially the documents you need to look at and consider are your admission agreement and any supporting communication you got at the time you were admitted. So was there anything from the local authority that provided any level of protection or security for you, which you could actually glean from that documentation, even if, for example, there wasn't a formal guarantee in place? There might be a letter that actually suggests that there should have been, or that acts as a guarantee. Then have you got any specific guarantee information and supporting information actually around that? Then any subsequent communication and agreement, so things like, did you change status, or did you provide different contracts which were with different organizations or whatever, then which related to the pension fund? Then again, any of those might have an impact as well. You also need the copy of your employer specific actuarial valuation results, so you'll have got those probably at some point late in 2019. If you disclose under FRS as well your FRS results, because that will sort of give you a lot of information in terms of, even if your employer results don't give you exit debts, it'll give you an idea or a way of actually working out what the likely cessation debt actually is. Looking at your membership information and also alternative schemes, so things like, what would be the level of contribution offered in an alternative scheme, because one of the things you need to look at is if your costs fell in terms of your primary contributions and that saved you some money, would you be able to then use that money to fund an exit to a point where your cash flow payments were broadly similar to what they were prior to that? And usually that can be a surprising one. Often organizations can do that and actually don't realize that they're actually in a position to do it. If you're paying 30% contribution on your salary roll and that was to fall to 8%, then the 22% that you're actually saving may be enough to actually allow you to fund either a cessation or a deferred debt arrangement to allow you to stop accruing. And then you've also got your member contract of employment to identify if there's any contractual rights in there that you would need to manage in terms of any transition, and also the funds funding strategy statement to confirm what they're actually sort of prepared to do. So just to sort of finish up then in terms of, I think this feels like the end of the lobbying process, and there's a sort of a great opportunity for organizations to sort of better manage their risk, which wasn't there previously. Obviously it gives you the chance to sort of consider your position. I think one of the crucial things about this is you really want to avoid what I describe as inadvertent or unmanaged cessation. So getting down to a low number of members and then suddenly them all leaving and it triggering a debt. You really need to be in a position where you've got a pension policy that you understand will manage this, and you know how it's going to play out as those members leave. So obviously you're wanting to engage with your sort of advisor around what those options might be. Then based on that, engage with the fund over what the process might be of engaging with them and looking at different options. And then obviously if you do decide to change or close the scheme, then you'll need to transition staff to an alternative scheme. So you'll need to have that in place, although most organizations I would suspect have got a scheme that covers auto enrollment now in any case. So pretty much on the sort of 45 minutes. So thanks very much for listening to that. Obviously now I'll stop sharing my screen all the way well, and happy to take questions.
Hi David, I've just got a few questions here, so I'll just start off in the order that they came in. The first one is from Simon. He's asking, we have the FRS 102 valuation for our organisation. How can we get the valuation on an ongoing basis and the cessation value? Will we incur costs to get this information? Our FRS 102 liabilities are 750k, to give you a sense of scale.
Okay. Right. So the FRS produces figures on a different basis. So the FRS is effectively something that's provided to the employer, in inverted commas, and the employer is actually responsible for the assumptions in there. What normally happens is that the fund just produces these and sends them out, and you actually just accept them. But you don't actually have to do that. So subject to you taking your own advice around that, you can actually set your own assumptions based on your own scenarios. Now, we do that with organizations, for example, the funds tend to take a very conservative stance on salary increases, for example, which wouldn't be consistent with what the organization would do. So if you reduce the salary increase, for example, that will reduce the liabilities, which will improve your FRS deficit and therefore your balance sheet position. So there's ways of actually dealing with that. So you wouldn't get the information related to the FRS. You could broadly work it out, or I could broadly work it out from the FRS calculation, because you're just applying the same the different discount rate to the liabilities effectively, and using the same assets. You should have had an ongoing funding valuation basis from your fund at the end of 2019, based on the 2019 actual valuation, and that should have shown you your projected contributions from April 2020, but also your funding position at March 2019 on an ongoing and on a cessation basis. If it didn't show it on a cessation basis, there's only 4 firms of actuaries that do this on behalf of funds. 2 of them are great because they automatically produce cessation figures, and 2 of them don't automatically produce cessation figures, which is a bit of an irritation. When that does happen, I tend to get clients to go back to the fund and actually just say, look, I suspect you're asking us to be funding this on a cessation basis, and yet you haven't provided us with those numbers in the valuation. I'd like you to provide us with those numbers. And I would argue very robustly if they were suggesting that you would have to pay for them, because in my view, if that's the basis on which they're charging your liabilities, they should be providing you with the information on the basis that they're actually doing that. So I would tend to get quite irate with them if they suggested they were actually going to charge for that. But hopefully within your valuation, there will actually be numbers around that anyway. Yeah. So, and if you don't, as I said, my expectation would be that if your FRS liability probably at about 2% discount rate, 750,000, then your cessation debt is going to be probably somewhere in the region of 1.5 million-ish, and your ongoing position probably is going to be relatively neutral, maybe sort of 100%, somewhere between maybe 90, 92, 95, 100% funded. But without actually sort of being able to do the calcs, I don't know, but I would expect the figures to be of that sort of broad magnitude.
Okay, we have the next question is from Claire Keach. We left the scheme in autumn 2019 after the last member of our staff who was a member of the scheme left. Our cessation report valued our deficit at circa 634k. Our previous valuation was based on the 2016 actuarial valuation of around 350k. So Claire's question is, if we ask for a new cessation valuation since a 2019 scheme valuation was issued after the cessation report, and my treasurer felt strongly that the cessation report should be based on the 2019 rather than the 2016 scheme valuation.
Well, the cessation liability, whatever you get reported in your various valuations isn't actually relevant, because the cessation valuation is based on the actual date you exit. So it's based on the market conditions on the date that you actually exit. So if you got a valuation today, then that will be different from the valuation you would have got in September 2019, in March 2019, for example. Now, from memory, gilt yields at around that point, I think, and don't quote me on this, but I think it were about 1.2, 1.3%, something like that. And your exit debt on that would have been calculated on that basis, but it also would have taken into account things like inflation. So if inflation, for example, if inflation goes up, then the value of your liabilities goes up because you're providing the pension increasing at a higher amount. If it falls, your pension's going up at a lower rate, therefore your liabilities actually fall. If gilt yields fall, then the value of your liabilities rises. If gilt yields rise, then the value of your liabilities fall. So if you're at 1.3 gilt yield at that point, I suspect the gilt yield now is probably about 1.1. So I would expect that the liabilities on that basis would be higher. However, I think over the period inflation has fallen. It's quite difficult to pin this down too accurately because, for example, there was a 3-week spell last year where gilt yields went from 0.9% to 1.2% to 0.45% to 1.1% in the space of 3 weeks. So it's quite difficult to actually pin it down. But you're depending on the scenarios, your exit debt is probably, I would expect that maybe inflation has fallen, which will have slightly improved the position. Gilt yields might have fallen, which might have worsened the position. The fact that you're actually closed means that you're not accruing more liabilities, so your deficit position is likely to be more set, is likely to be more certain. So you've probably got something that's quite similar to what you had previously. But certainly you can ask for an updated valuation, but undoubtedly the fund, if you're asking for anything updated outside of a valuation, will probably charge you to get the actuary to do it.
Okay, the next question is from Tina Taylor. Does an individual cease to be an active participant when they retire? We only have one member of staff in the LGPS. Would we work towards cessation based on their retirement age?
Yes. So you're deemed, your active member status relates to the fact that you're a contributing member building up benefits. So as soon as you retire, then you're not. So effectively that would trigger your cessation. Yeah. So and obviously the thing about that is you've got the member's retirement date, so you know when the cessation is going to be on that basis. But clearly the individual could decide to retire earlier than that or leave. You know, one of the things I'd say you have to be wary of in that is if you've got anyone who's been in the scheme for a very long time. Because if I'm trying to remember the dates, I think it's sort of something like pre-2012. You still have sort of rights to what are called the rule of 80, which is where if your service and your age total 80, then you're entitled to take your benefits earlier than your normal retirement date. So for example, if you had someone who was 57 with 23 years service and they had that benefit, they could retire on full benefits. They could effectively retire on full benefits at 57. So you just need to be aware that if you're funding towards someone's retirement age, that's when they're likely to actually retire, and they're not going to retire or leave earlier than that because that would trigger the debt earlier. Okay,
the next question is from Pat Wood. What happens if a charity remains in the fund but the charity ceases to operate because they cannot secure ongoing funding?
Okay, so then you effectively become an insolvent organisation. So I've unfortunately had this where the organisation has tried to wind up, do a CVA on the basis that they were expecting to be break even on funds, but without actually understanding that there was actually a pension deficit involved. So it would end up as an insolvent wind up effectively. The fund doesn't have any preferential creditor status, so the fund actually just fits in with all the other ordinary creditors, and would actually have to queue up to get a share of whatever was left in the organisation. Obviously the membership would cease. It wouldn't impact on the members' benefits because they're part of the big pooled arrangement, the sort of the huge fund within the sort of local government scheme, effectively everyone else that's in the scheme is standing over their benefits. So the members would still be entitled to get their full benefits without any reduction.
Okay, we've now got a question from Alan Buchanan. David, you mentioned active members. If the last member of our active members were to leave employment and become a deferred member, does that trigger the cessation debt, or can we properly remain in the scheme and continue to fund on an ongoing liability basis?
In theory, if that's your only member, yeah. Now, the only proviso I would add to this is it also depends on your status within the scheme. So if you're deemed to be, you can be deemed to be a closed employer or an open employer. An open employer would allow you to admit another member. A closed employer, it wouldn't. If you're a closed employer, then that member leaving would trigger your debt effectively. So then you'd have a timing issue around the cessation debt and potentially the payment of that. If that is something that's actually likely to happen, then in my view, this is where I said early engagement is valuable. You know, you're probably better talking to the fund and actually engaging with them over, you know, look, this is likely to happen. How can we actually go about dealing with this when it actually happens that will avoid the insolvency of the organisation? Because the funds have a lot less flexibility when the debt has actually triggered than they do if they come to an agreement prior to the debt actually triggering. So that's why I would say sort of the earlier you can actually engage around this, the better, because you might be able to engage with the fund, particularly with these new options coming in, and actually say, you know, we want to be in a position where when this member leaves, we can just continue to pay as we go along. And how do we go about doing that? But I think you want to, if you're down to one member, you probably want to get to a point where you sort of engage with that as early as possible.
Okay, we've now got a question from Karen Johnson, so there's two questions.
Okay.
The first question is, under the option to spread the cessation debt, what effect would it have on our accounts? How does the crystallised debt number get accounted for on the balance sheet?
Okay, yes. Now that is a good one. Effectively, if you pay the debt, so if you have a debt and you pay it as a single payment, then effectively, obviously, it just comes off your assets in terms of actually sort of as a settlement, effectively. If you do it as a repayment arrangement, then your auditor will probably account it as the discounted net present value of your future payments. Yeah. So what that would mean would be, so say you're paying £100,000 in 10 installments of £10,000 each. Yeah. Then the most recent payment of £10,000 is worth £10,000, but the next instalment would be £10,000 less a discount rate, less a value for the fact that it's 12 months away. Then the second year will be discounted because it's 2 years away, then 3 years away and 4 years away. So your £100,000, the net present value of that is probably about £85,000 or £90,000, something like that. And that would then be a net liability, effectively, which would reduce year on year as you made the payments. So you'd have the £100,000 liability less the discounting effect. So let's say 90,000. You pay 10,000, then that falls to 80,000, but it might go up slightly because of the sort of nearer payments. So it might be 81,000 and so on until over the 10-year period you've actually paid it off.
Okay, the next part of the question is exit date for the calculation of the cessation debt within the discretion of the actuary. I'm trying to understand how predictable the date of the calculation will be if we were to pay for it to be done at a particular point in time.
Yeah, so the actuary does have a lot of discretion over the calculation of the exit debt, but fortunately they don't tend to use it. So pretty much all the actuaries will do the calculation of the exit debt on exactly the same basis, which is effectively based on the gilt yield and a sort of an inflation measure and a set of mortality assumptions, actually. So if you can get to a point where you've got an indication of if you where you have an indication of what the cessation debt is, then in my view, generally, unless you're actually seriously looking at exiting, then probably having another valuation isn't really that helpful, because what will happen is it will probably take the actuary a couple of months to actually calculate it, which means it will be based on 2 months previously. So by the time you get it, it'll already be 2 months out of date. Yeah. So and if you're exiting, then I would suggest you're actually better getting advice around exiting and the timing of the exit, because one of the things that you'd want to be doing around that is actually looking at inflation, looking at your previous calculation, and then looking at inflation and the discount rate and see how those have moved, and trying to actually time the date that you're actually looking for the calculation. Yeah, because that's probably going to be more important in terms of actually trying to. So like as I say, even over the last 10 days, I think sort of gilt yields have moved by about 0.25% upwards, thankfully, which has been a rarity in these recent times. But even having done it sort of 2 weeks ago in comparison to today, would have got you a much worse result. So I think getting the timing of that is actually quite important.
Okay, the next question is from Georgette Smith. Apologies if I haven't pronounced your name properly. The question is, if you have one member in the scheme for 28 years, will the final salary pension up to 2014 is based on your salary in 2014 or what you are earning today, although numbers of years in pension is still up to 2014?
Yep, good question. So the final salary is calculated as at your final salary. So it would be if your final salary is 3 years or 5 years or 10 years in the future, it's based on that final salary, but it's only based on that salary for your period of service up until 2014. Yeah. So so it's not based on your salary at 2014. It's your salary at the point you actually retire. So you'd have your salary calculated for those 2014 that 2014 period of service. Based on your final salary. Then you'd have your care benefit from 2014 onwards based on your salary each year through until the point that you actually get to retirement. So let's say your retirement date was 2024 to keep things simple, and you've been in the scheme for say you were in the scheme for 28 years up until 2014, then you have 28 years over 60 times your salary at 2024, yeah, plus another so that'd be 14 through to 10 years care service based on your salary each year through until 2024.
Okay, the next question is from Brett. Do we have the right to see the detailed workings of the actuary's calculations, or can they merely present us with a number along with the major assumptions, e.g. inflation, assumed discount rate, etc.?
Yeah, if you get a sort of a formal exit quote, then the actuary will have to provide you with details of the workings effectively. To be honest, actually, the workings don't really, the calculation is based on probably 4 or 5 sort of key factors, which you've named some there. So inflation and discount rate are by far and away the most influential ones. Then you've got mortality assumptions. Then you've also got what's happening with your asset value. That will obviously impact it as well. And then the last thing would be if the fund, as part of the exit valuation, makes any other market adjustment. So one of the things that a lot of the funds do is when you exit, because they don't know what mortality is going to be in the future, they add a mortality weighting, and that weighting would be part of your cessation calculation. But the value of that wouldn't be shown, but I could work out what the value was. So, but it'll tell you that a 5% weighting has been applied on mortality assumptions, so to reach this, to get to that result. So all those calculations or all those assessments would actually be in there. The Faculty of Actuaries has a requirement when an actuary produces results like this, is that it's called a technical actuarial standard, that effectively another actuary must be able to pick up the work that they've done and have all the assumptions available that would allow them to work out the same numbers. So yes, it'll provide you with pretty much everything you'd need to know.
Okay, the next question is from Malcolm. If our last active member left in October 2018 and we have had a cessation value, although not paid as yet, do we have any new options under this new legislation?
Again, you're in probably a quite unusual position there, in that it's rare that the fund actually just chooses to defer the cessation valuation. I would say that they've probably taken that, as I said, as a sort of a voluntary decision in terms of actually doing that, and it probably doesn't fit totally under the prior to 2020 LGPS regulations. And I'm guessing here, I couldn't be certain without engaging with the fund, but I'm guessing that when the new regulations come in, they would probably prefer to have something that was on a formal basis linked to what the regulations actually now say. Yeah. But again, I couldn't 100% guarantee that, but that would certainly be my expectation. I think they would want something that wasn't sitting outside what the regulation said, rather have something that is directly related to what the new regulations say.
Okay, I've got no further written questions. That was the last one.
Okay.
I believe John has got his hand up, so I don't know, John, whether you can put your mic on and ask your question.
Yes, hi David. I've just got a question. Yep, hi. It looks like the deferred debt arrangement looks more attractive than just a plain cessation repayment option, because you're allowed to remain in the scheme. So my question is that the case? And B, would the fund allow you to remain invested in the scheme for a long period of time? And then secondly, just on the employer covenant, I think for charities, they're likely to have a pretty weak covenant, because they don't have assets to pledge, or their funding is uncertain in the future. Yeah. So will the contributions then, because of a weak covenant, be quite high, that the fund is likely to be quite risk averse in agreeing a deferred debt arrangement with a local office?
Really good question. So if I deal with the second one actually first, in terms of, interesting in the guidance that's actually been issued around the deferred debt, the Scheme Advisory Board has specifically said that just because there isn't a strong covenant, for example, it shouldn't rule out the fund from actually entering into deferred debt arrangements, because they can actually prove that those are in the interest of the fund as a whole, which is something that I agree with and I've been arguing for a number of years. Because again, if you sort of take the sort of extreme positions to a certain extent, so why should the fund, if the fund has you in the scheme at the moment, for example, and you're accruing additional liabilities and not paying any contributions to actually sort of effectively pay down the debt, then you're building up more and more risk in the fund and more problems for other for other employers potentially, and you've got no protection over those liabilities anyway. So is it not better for the fund in that scenario to actually have stop further accrual and be making any contributions that you can actually afford to pay towards funding the debt actually sort of going forward, so that's actually reducing, and the reducing risk is better for the rest of the employers in the scheme. So I think that I have to admit that I've had difficulty getting funds over many years to actually sort of understand the logic of that. But hopefully they're starting to sort of grasp the sort of the issue now. In terms of the sort of funding and the sort of the covenant basis, so as I say, I think that can actually be dealt with, and I think any proposal can make that, can make that point. In terms of the sort of the approach that the funds take, I wouldn't be at all surprised if they did make some sort of a differential. And in fact, if I was advising, and I would actually work out that too, in terms of a differential in the discount rate that reflects the sort of the weaker covenant. So they're trying, because where I think the problem, so say for example, using my example, on an ongoing basis, in that example you were fully funded, and on an account and on a cessation basis there was a deficit of £600,000, for example. Yeah. Now on that basis, then you could just run the contributions on into the future, or run the position on into the future, not be paying any contributions. Yeah. I think the fund would want in that position to be able to pay some form of contribution to gradually work your way towards that figure. So one of the things we've designed with some sort of clients we've been working with is a model that actually sort of says, well, if I made an assumption over 20 years I wanted to pay this off, and I got a return of X, what would my contributions actually be? So again, I think that's a stronger message going back to the fund and actually saying, look, this is the position at the moment. This is what we're prepared to do going forward, and this will actually deal with your problem over this period of time. So I wouldn't be at all surprised if the funds did do that. But equally, my view in terms of what I'm doing with my clients is I'm actually preempting that almost by looking at the organisation, working out what's affordable, putting a funding plan together based on what's affordable, justifying that with an investment return to pay off the debt over a period of time, and then you've got a message to actually go back to the fund to say, look, we've come up with a proposal that will actually deal with this, and this is why it's in your interest to do it, and hopefully I've been doing that with a couple of funds in Scotland actually recently, and they've recognised the value of that. And they actually specifically asked for proposals as to what we'd want to do, and I think that could be something that potentially could work as well.
Okay, we've got a second question from Gadget. I know it is not advisable, but if the last active member leave the scheme but carry on working for the employer, say to auto-enrolment, am I right to say the organisation becomes liable for cessation liability? Yeah,
it's as soon as the active member leaves the scheme. Yeah, so as soon as they're not paying contributions, there's no one paying contributions to the scheme, then yeah, the cessation liability kicks in.
Okay, and a second question from Karen Johnson. Do you know how particular actuarial firms are taking positions around the logic that weak covenant with DDA is better than ongoing accrual? Our valuation is by Hymans Robertson.
At this stage, unfortunately, I don't. It's a difficult one as well, because there's 4 firms tend to do all the sort of valuations. One of the difficulties as well is that even you get differences in approach between actuaries within the same firm, so it's quite problematic. I think in my experience, Hymans tend to be the ones that adopt the most sensible and pragmatic approach to this, and indeed were the actuaries that I'm aware of had actually arranged sort of solutions similar to what have come out in the new regulations prior to the new regulations having come out. So I've got copies of valuations, for example, from Hymans that actually show them doing a almost deferred debt process for an employer pre the deferred debt process actually being in place. So I think they've shown a lot of flexibility in terms of actually doing that. So I would be expecting that I would hope that they would be ones that would be reasonably good about sort of how they'd actually go about arranging a DDA or assisting their employer to arrange a DDA, or their fund to do it.
Okay, we have a question from James. To what extent is it advisable to deliberately keep a scheme open but on a very limited basis?
I suppose the key point about that is probably around affordability. Yeah. So you know, what are you doing it because effectively there's no other alternative? So you know, which is where, you know, I think if I was sort of looking at that, my view would probably be that obviously that's much better than accruing additional liabilities for a lot more members. However, what I would probably say would be, what you should probably look at is there a mechanism whereby you can fund that, but you can actually pay additional contributions to improve the position in the future. Now, one of the things I've looked at and I've modelled with clients actually around doing this is, so say for example you've got an organisation, you've got £1 million of salary roll for X number of employees, and you close to new entrants, yeah, and you're paying a 25% contribution, so you're paying £250,000 a year as the contribution actually to the scheme for all the members, yeah. Because you're closing new entrants, say for example the next year your membership has fallen, and now your salary roll is £800,000. So your £25,000 cost is now £200,000. Yeah. But you could quite clearly pay £250,000. So what's happened for the organisation is you've effectively banked £50,000 from the saving of people leaving. Yeah. Even though you could afford to pay that amount of money. Now, one of the things you could look at over a period of time if you're doing that is actually saying, okay, well, if we start with that payment profile as to how much we afford to pay, and rather than each time we pay that money, each time that member leaves, we bank that money, what we do is we actually pay that money to the fund, yeah, to pre-fund our ultimate cessation payment. Then the vast majority of organisations would have pre-funded their exit payment through actually going through that process. Because that also goes back to the point I was making about, if you're doing that, you're making those contributions at the start when you get the biggest value from them. You know, if you make that £50,000 contribution at the start for 20 years, it's going to have a huge value, as opposed to if you actually make that £50,000 contribution the year before the cessation, it's only going to be worth £50,000. Yeah. So actually, thinking about what's affordable and how you actually pay for it, yeah, is beneficial. So if you're keeping members in, I would actually be looking at, well, what additional amount of money is potentially available to pre-fund my exit debt? If, however, as an alternative, if you can avoid accruing any more liabilities, because undoubtedly accruing more liabilities will be worsening your exit position year on year, because you'll not be paying enough contribution. You'll be paying a contribution to cover your ongoing liabilities, but not your accounting and cessation liabilities. Therefore, your position will be getting worse. What would be much better would actually be able to stop accrual and actually to arrange some form of deferred debt arrangement. Yeah, because I think that way, whatever money you're actually committing. So in that example, if you have 2 or 3 members in and you're paying 25% of salary for them, you put them into a whatever 10%, 8% DC scheme, and you pay the balance into the pension fund to fund the deferred debt. That to me seems like a better solution longer term than actually continuing to build up more liabilities. But again, it's driven by the affordability.
Okay, David. That is nearly at 3:30. I don't see any more questions or any more hands up at the moment.
Okay. Good stuff.
I'd just like to say then, thank you, David, for a really useful session there. Just to remind people that if you have got confidential questions, you could still email John and we'll pass those through to David to deal with. And if you want to follow up with any, obviously, bits of advice, then you can contact David directly by email if you want to take things further and decisions further with your organisation. Please do so. We will circulate the video to you all. And try and get sort of a summary of kind of the questions that have been coming through as well to share with you all, so you can refer to them at a later point. So finally, just thank you, David, for your time, and thank you all for your questions and contributions. That's been really good to see such engagement.
Okay, thanks a lot, everyone.
Great. Thank you, David. Bye.
Okay, so I'll exit as well now, and I'll speak
Yeah.
to you.
Yeah,
Okay,
lovely. Thank
thanks
you.
very much.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, bye.
Bye-bye.